أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب رب العالمين. الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله. والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين خاتم النبيين سيدنا الممجد بشير المصدق المصطفى الأمجد محمود الأحمد أبي القاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين، ولعنة الله على الظالمين من الأولين والآخرين. أما بعد، فقد قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه المجيد وفرقانه الحميد وقوله الحق: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الذين يتبعون الرسول النبي الأمي الذي يجدونه مكتوبا عندهم في التوراة والإنجيل يأمرهم بالمعروف وينهاهم عن المنكر ويحل لهم الطيبات ويحرم عليهم الخبائث ويضع عنهم إصرهم وأغلال التي كانت عليهم، فالذين آمنوا به وعزروه ونصروه واتبعوا النور الذي أنزل معه أولئك هم المفلحون. آمنا بالله. صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلوات على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Awaited Savior of humanity, Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam, my respected brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to our next part of our series on decolonizing the Muslim mind. In our last discussion, we spoke about how the Holy Prophet of Islam, Rasulullah Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam, liberated the community in Mecca. We have spoken about the verse in particular that is the underlying verse for the entirety of our series, and the words in particular that we are trying to understand at the time of Rasulullah, and how such a verse may be applicable for you and I today. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the mission statement as وَيَضَعُ عَنْهُمْ إِصْرَهُمْ وَأَغْلَالَ الَّتِي كَانَتْ عَلَيْهِمْ, that Rasulullah must remove the burdens from people's shoulders and break the shackles that have been placed upon them. When we spoke about removing the burdens, we mentioned that this was how the other communities of faith had inherited their practices, and the way in which the Jews and the Christians and the Zoroastrians had misused their own scriptures, prophetic narrations, and as such had grown up into the cycle of misapplying their own religion and thinking that this was something from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When it comes to breaking the shackles, this was not religion, this was society, and the way in which society perpetuated its own norms. They would bury their daughters alive, they would sell their family members into slavery, and so on and so forth. As a result, the Meccan community just grew up into these norms and practiced these for themselves, generation after generation. And people weren't thinking about the practices that they were doing, it just became habitual, one generation after the next. We started yesterday by speaking about أغلال التي كانت عليهم at the more specific level. And how did Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam break the shackles of the Meccan society? And we stated that there was a principle or a leading problem within the society, and that was their belief in idols. Why was this problematic? Because when you can believe that something made of sticks and stones and mud and from your own hands has power over you, the mind has been shackled to such an extent that one is not thinking rationally about what they believe in. As a result, the mind becomes so shackled that when someone asks you to do something, even as morally bereft, something as terrible as burying your own daughter alive, you would not question it. And so Rasulullah had to go about breaking the shackles of this particular issue, which would ultimately open up the mind and flourish the mind in all different other fields. This is where we stopped yesterday. And just to pick up on this and then move into this evening's discussion, inshallah, this principle that Rasulullah applied at the sociological level is a standard principle even within akhlaq, even within spirituality. You and I are the products of the many years of conditioning that we have taken upon for ourselves. We spoke on one of the previous nights about the way in which children grow up and adopt what is already around them in their surroundings. We mentioned there is their nature and then there is their nurture. That which their parents expose them to, that which the Husayniyya exposes them to, that which the school and the universities exposes them to, all has an impact on their mind. And as a result, they become very much part and parcel of the wider society. In terms of our own akhlaq, in terms of our own thought process, in terms of everything that we are also very much a product of that which we have exposed ourselves to. It could be exposing ourselves to the reading that we do in our own spare time. It could be exposing ourselves to the lectures. It could be exposing ourselves to Hollywood. It can be exposing ourselves to MTV. All of these things have impacts upon you and I as individuals. We are nothing more than sponges as human beings, just taking everything in without even realizing what we are taking in. When it comes, for example, to Shahr Ramadan, or going on ziyarah, or going on hajj, we often think about changing ourselves to become better people over that journey that we are taking. What needs to be done is understanding ourselves as individuals and realizing what are the primary or the root causes for the reasons in which the way you and I are as people. If we understand those root idols or the root challenges, and we can break the roots of that which holds us back as individuals, that one root will open up the doors to everything else that we can change for ourselves. So this is an individual principle of change, to understand the underlying effects of why we are the way in which we are, why we think and why we act the way in which we act. And when we become as a society at large, the principle is also the same. There are underlying reasons as to why we are the way we are. Now think about this for a minute when it comes to the world today in 2016. A simple question. When you see the world the way it is, good or bad, why is it that the way the world is, it is this way? For what reason? What are the underlying reasons that have shaped society over generations to think and to act the way in which it does? For example, we might say that people en masse are exposed to very similar things. They're exposed to the media. They're exposed to Hollywood. They're exposed to education. They're exposed to mainstream TV. Now, if you imagine the millions, nay, billions of people that around the world are by and large exposed to the very same things, it is very easy to see why mankind today is also thinking along very similar lines. And those who are exposed to slightly different things, they are the ones that break from the norms of whatever society creates the boundaries of thinking. Think about this for a second. Think about news. We normally say that when it comes to politics, there's such a thing as right wing and left wing. And we will talk about what right and left and centrist politics are, so we understand the way in which those thought processes also impact society. But we also imagine that we have right-wing media and we have left-wing media. So for example, one might say that the Sun newspaper is a far-right or at least centre-right newspaper. The Independent is a center-left paper. And so the discourse that mainstream society is exposed to is within these two brackets, by and large. It requires an individual to go out of that to find something further right-wing or something further left-wing. But society is exposed to this spectrum. And so growing up for a generation, society will only think within this spectrum itself. What happens for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years when people are only exposed to that bracket of thinking? When a politician or an ideology comes forward that goes outside of that bracket, it is now seen as radical. It's not actually radical, but it's shaped as being radical. So for example, in the United States of America, Bernie Sanders is saying something very mainstream left-wing policy, in the essence of left-wing policy, not today's left-wing policy. Jeremy Corbyn here is saying something very normal when it comes to left-wing politics. But because the bracketing places it within these frameworks, when Jeremy Corbyn or Bernie Sanders speak, apparently they're very far left, they're radical left. They're not radical left. They're very, very normal left-wing policies. But because the discourse is framed in a certain way, we are now told this is very radical. Immediately society molds you to think, and it takes a mind to be able to break that molding and break that shackle of thinking that someone else is trying to impose upon your mind. In the same way, this was happening in Mecca, that the way in which people were living was within this bracket, and anything outside of that was seen to be so radical. أَجَعَلَ آلِهَةً إِلَهًا وَاحِدًا? Does this man make our gods into one God? What a strange thing this is. Even though they were Meccans who lived in a city that was built by the hands of Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam. How strange. Imagine they grow up in a city where the Kaaba is, that they know the history of their own city is predicated on Tawheed, predicated on Hajj for the sake of one Lord. They know it all. Their life source of Zamzam water has come from the stories of Ibrahim and Ismail salamullahi alayhima. Yet, when someone called them towards Tawheed, what a strange thing this is, they said. How can that be? That their whole city is predicated on Tawheed, but when someone calls them towards Tawheed, this is something strange for them. Because for a period of centuries, they had been told, this is the way you are supposed to live. And they could not think outside of those brackets. Now, if you understand what we're saying, we are likening this to the way the world is today. We grow up into a society that tells you how you must think, how you must live, and the brackets in which how you and I must act. And the moment someone comes with something beyond that, he is radical, he is extreme. This is what happens to Islam as well. And so when Muslims grow up into that normalized society, they are forced to think within these parameters. And the moment someone wants to think beyond that, they are also radical. What a strange human being this is. How different he thinks. Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam, he broke the underlying pin that held all of those thoughts together. And this is the way in which he flourished their mind. Now, having done this in Mecca and made great gains amongst people who are ready to have their shackles broken, as Harriet Tubman said, I freed 1,000 slaves, but I could have freed 1,000 more had they known that they were slaves in the first place. Rasulullah saved 1,000 people, but he could have saved another 1,000 if only they knew that they were being tricked by those people who felt that they were going to lose out on power, money and wealth and property. That tricked them into thinking the way in which they were being beguiled into thinking. Now, the way in which Meccans did this was very terrifying. Again, think about it in accordance with the 21st century. You will remember the story of the great companion Bilal al-Habashi. May Allah bless him with the highest ranks of Jannah, inshaAllah. You and I know Bilal al-Habashi for primarily one reason, that he is the first mu'adhin in Islam. However, when they moved towards Medina, Bilal al-Habashi wasn't just the first mu'adhin, no. He was the first accountant of Islam. He was responsible for the Baytul Mal inside Medina. Look at this. 1 minute ago, a black person was a slave, had no rights, could not be educated. When they come to Medina, Bilal al-Habashi is now the first accountant of Baytul Mal. To show you the way in which Mecca treated Bilal al-Habashi, many of us would have watched the film The Message. Especially when we were growing up, people watched this film in order to see how Muslim or Islam came about. In The Message, they showed the very famous scene of how Umayyah ibn Khalaf treated his slave Bilal al-Habashi. Famously, they take him out under the open skies, they lie him down, they place a very large rock upon his chest. And so he is burning underneath the heat of the sun, but also there is a rock upon his chest, and so he cannot breathe properly. Many of us will have seen this torture that was done, or heard or read in the books. This is how Bilal was tortured. It didn't stop there. In fact, Bilal al-Habashi was tortured in far worse ways than just this particular type of punishment upon him. The books of biography say that Umayyah ibn Khalaf, his master, the slave owner at that time, did 2 additional grave punishments to Bilal al-Habashi for becoming a Muslim. The first one was, he used to force Bilal onto his knees and hands like a dog, tie a rope around his neck, walk him like an animal on all fours through the streets of Mecca, and invite the children of Mecca to throw stones at Bilal al-Habashi. It didn't end there. After having been made to walk up and down on all fours in the day through the streets of Mecca, Umayyah ibn Khalaf would take him and make him sleep and eat in the pens of the sheep. Yet, Bilal al-Habashi was willing to stay a Muslim because he understood the way in which society was so decadent at that time and wanted to be part of that movement to break that society's shackles. I see how I am being treated. Black, slave, no rights, how my friends in humanity are being treated. It is worth me going through these trials and difficulties in order to help mankind break from these shackles in Medina, in Mecca. And so, having sought thousands of people and freed many people from these shackles within Mecca, Rasulullah is now invited towards Medina. As we stated in the previous nights, amongst the challenges in the Medinan community was that tribes would go to war at the drop of a hat for as long as possible. And we mentioned stories about, for example, how there would be a woman who would just walk past and be glanced by another tribe, and a war would break out between the tribes for generations. And we mentioned a story of how a race between camel herders created 40 years of war between them. Aus and Khazraj were 2 major tribes within the city of Medina, known as Yathrib before Rasulullah migrated. They would go to war with each other for 200 years. And eventually, as a tribe had decimated their resources, their numbers, so badly that they needed someone external to be able to create peace between them. And so, as you know, they go towards Hajj and they meet with Rasulullah, they give their pledge, and on the 2nd year, Rasulullah goes towards Medina and establishes himself within the city of Medina. What were the specific trials within Medina that created the problems within that society, within that community? We mentioned in Mecca, the underlying problem of society was shirk. However, within Medina, they weren't pagans in the Meccan sense. Medina, by and large, was a very plural society. They had people who were Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians. They weren't worshipping idols. They were people of faith. However, not only were there Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians, according to the history of Medina, they also were broken down into a great number of sects. Just like we have today, sectarian rivalry. In Medina, the plural society also had different types of sects within the Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-A'raf, verse number 168, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, وَقَطَّعْنَاهُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ أُمَمًا مِنْهُمُ الصَّالِحُونَ وَمِنْهُمْ دُونَ ذَلِكَ وَبَلَوْنَاهُمْ بِالْحَسَنَاتِ وَالسَّيِّئَاتِ لَعَلَّهُمْ يَرْجِعُونَ. And we cut them up on the earth into parties, into groups, into sects. Some of them were righteous and some of them were not righteous, falling short of their responsibilities to God. And so we tried them with blessings and misfortunes so they may return back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In Medina, there were religions and there were many, many sects. The problems with this were that each of the sects would vie with each other in which one was more correct, which one was closer to God, which one was the chosen sect, and which one was the chosen religion of God Almighty. Does it sound like something that we know today? Sectarianism was present within Medina. But the way in which sectarianism was present within Medina was very dangerous for the people of Medina at that time. And the particular shackle that would break them, that would continue to hold their thinking, that Rasulullah had to break from them. In Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions many times the stories particular to Banu Israel, and mentions ayat about the way in which the previous communities dealt with their scriptures. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, الَّذِينَ يَكْتَبُونَ الْكِتَابَ بِأَيْدِيهِمْ. Those people who write the book with their own hands, then they say, هَذَا مِنْ عِنْدِ اللَّهِ. This is from God. The prime problem within Medina was that each sect was vying with each other, but how did they vie with each other? They would change their religion, change their beliefs in order to prove one was right over the other one. Argument through religion and changing religion in order to vie with each other. Now imagine what this does over generations. If you have a religion that is just innately lying, rabbis and priests that are innately creating things to bend religion to their own whim in order to make it beneficial for their own selves, in order to prove and disprove all the other sects, the religion falls apart. Doesn't it sound like today? When you have religion such as Islam today, and the breadth of leadership and the spectrum of leadership that you have today, and everyone speaking in the name of Islam. You have this mufti and you have that mufti, you have this sheikh and you have that sheikh, and then you have this president, and then you have this king, and then you have this queen, and then you have... All of these people separate religion, and ultimately the eventual outcome of it can not be anything other than we see today. If you're going to take the types of leadership that we have in the Muslim world today as leadership, as some sort of legitimate leadership, you cannot expect anything other than the way Islam is being practiced today. Similarly, 1400 years ago in Medina, these same problems were prevalent. that religion was being monopolized for the sake of people's wealth, for the sake of sectarianism, and ultimately for the sake of vying with each other. It had not produced goodness between themselves. And so the religious tenets were used in opposition to what God truly wanted. When Rasulullah saw this division amongst people and realized that this division amongst faith and the manipulation and purposeful misreading of religious text was the source of the problem within Medina, he then had to go and change that in order to change the way in which people interacted with each other. He didn't deal with the symptom, the outcome. He didn't say, Jews and Christians, be good to each other. He didn't say, Muslims and Jews, be good to each other. He dealt with the causal factor of the reasons as to why they were enemies amongst each other. What did he do? There is a document that I beg every one of you to become acquainted with. If you have not heard of this, please, tonight, for the sake of Rasulullah, take 5 minutes and Google it and read it. If you have not read it in a while, go home tonight and read it. It is that important in accordance with the challenges we are facing today in the world. When he arrives within the city of Medina and he sees these tribes warring with each other and religious violence and sectarian strife, the first thing he does is bring all the religions and sects under one banner. This is called the Constitution of Medina. The Constitution of Medina. It is one of the most famous documents in the world, and in fact is the first document, the first ever politically governing document in the history of mankind. When we talk about the Magna Carta in 1066, who cares about the Magna Carta? Rasulullah 1400 years ago wrote the first ever governing document for how groups of people should live within a society. Ask a Muslim, do they know what it says? Do they know what's included in it? Have they ever shown it to the outside world to show the geniosity of Rasulullah? No wonder we are colonized and take these people as our leaders when we don't know what Rasulullah did 1400 years ago. This is a 40-point document governing the Jews and the Christians and the Muslims and the sects under one document. So for example, amongst the articles within this particular document, it will say that if a wrong is done to a Jew by a Muslim and the Muslim is in the wrong, it is compulsory for all Muslims to stand up against that Muslim to protect the rights of the Jew. 1400 years ago, when Jews were fighting with each other, Christians were fighting with each other, sectarian religious violence in the city of Medina. If someone is in the wrong, you have to stand with the oppressed over the oppressor. This was revolutionary at that time. They had never seen things like this. Up until 300 years ago in Europe, in France, if you were a Protestant, you were disallowed from going to the funeral of a Catholic. And if you were a Catholic, you were disallowed to go to the funeral of a Protestant. 1400 years ago, Rasulullah said, stand with the oppressed over the oppressor. The first line of this document is the most important, and this is what broke the shackles of sectarian violence, and this is what broke the shackle of religious hatred between the people of Medina and the tribes of Medina. Article 1, and listen closely to this. Anyone who has any questions about sectarianism, unity in Islam, return back to this particular article 1 of the document. He says, Rasulullah, those who sign up to this treaty, to this document, shall be considered as one ummah. Just think about that for a minute. Today, we think of ourselves that we have a Shia Ummah, which we are excluding everybody else. Or then we say that there is a Muslim Ummah, excluding everybody else. Or we think along lines of nationalities and say, I am British, therefore I am excluding the French. Or I am Pakistani, therefore I exclude the Indian. Or I'm Iraqi, and therefore I exclude the Kurd. Very immature, childish ways of thinking that have no place within Islam whatsoever. Rasulullah said, anyone who signs up to the document of creating goodness within a society, whether you are Jew or Christian or Zoroastrian or Muslim, you make up one ummah, one people. Look at the difference between the thinking of Rasulullah and the thinking of Muslims today in 2016. It is completely alien to one another. Yes, we have a Muslim ummah, but not when it conflicts with the greater need of humanity. The highest pedestal of identity within Islam is the human identity, because this is what we all share, irrespective of your faith or no faith, irrespective of your gender, your age, or your locality. And we'll talk about this in about 3 nights when we talk about nationalism and how nationalism has ruined Islam today. But think about these things very closely. What did that do to a Medinan community that was so used to fighting each other? When Rasulullah says, you are one people. Don't see yourself as Aus versus Khazraj. Don't see yourself as Tamim versus Banu Qaynuqa. Don't see yourself in these ways. You formulate one ummah so long as you are loyal to keeping goodness within society. If you break from that treaty of not having goodness in society, fine, then you're outside. You're on your own. But so long as you are adhering towards the principles of peace and social justice, growth within humanity, you are one people in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is revolutionary. Then, it's revolutionary now. People think Bernie Sanders is progressive, Jeremy Corbyn is progressive, that he's somehow radical left wing. Imagine you tell people you are one people in humanity. That's radical thinking. How it would shift mankind's thought process if we were to talk to them for a generation, not amongst sectarian lines, not amongst nationalistic lines, but amongst humanitarian lines. How would the next generation grow up thinking? Now, the fact that Rasulullah addressed people in this way, how do you think it changed the Medinan mindset? It changed them drastically. They no longer saw the other person as the other. They saw them as their equal. They saw them as people who are going to produce goodness for humanity. And here I'm going to mention 2 hadith, and I'm going to tell you them, and I want you to really reflect upon these hadith and think about them, not from history and say, yeah, but the Prophet. Think about you and I as individuals in society that carry so much negative baggage towards another person, towards a person of another sect, another faith, another nationality. And then the real nature of such hadith and the way in which Rasulullah really changed the spirit of people and the way in which they acted amongst each other. Listen to these 2 hadith. As you know, famously, when the Muhajirin arrived in Medina, the Ansar gave up half of their wealth. This is very well known. What did they do? 3 things occurred. 1, they gave up half their houses. The Ansar said to the Muhajirin, half my house is your house now. I will live upstairs, you live downstairs. I live on the right, you live on the left. Of that kind of nature, number 1. Number 2, they also said, you can have half of our wealth. you have left your wealth in Mecca. You could only carry what you could on your camels and horses in your migration. You've left so much. We will give you half of our wealth. Another hadith very famously said that the Ansar who had more than one wife would say to the Muhajirin men, whichever wife you prefer of mine, I divorce her and you can marry her. I'm not suggesting anyone does that today. Yes, we'll get in trouble. I'm not advocating for that. I'm just saying this is what the Muhajirin and the Ansar were like. This is what's commonly known. And many books talk about these things. But I want to go deeper into two narrations and make you think practically about the way in which society now was at the time of Rasulullah. Having seen the way the Ansar and the Muhajirin worked with each other, one hadith says, narrated by the great companion Jabir ibn Abdullah al-Ansari, may Allah grant him the highest of stations in Jannah. Jabir narrates the following hadith. He says, we used to have plantations in Medina. The economy in Medina was very date and plantation oriented. The economy in Mecca was more trade oriented. And so the Muhajirin were inexperienced as farmers. And so they had to learn a new trade because Medina was very much an agricultural based society. And so they started working. They came to Rasulullah and they would pick the dates. And sometimes the Muhajirin would have to try to go and practice their own forms of trade and leave the plantation, and sometimes they would be on the plantation. The Ansar, when the Muhajirin were not on the plantation, the Ansar would do the following. They would take the dates and they would pile them into two piles. 1, 2. And as they piled them into two piles, they would make the piles unbalanced, uneven. So what they would do is they would place more dates in one pile than in the other pile. Then, with the lesser pile, they would put sticks and stones in that pile, making it bigger. But actually there's less dates in it, but they make it seem like it's bigger. Then they wrap it up, and then they wrap this one up. So the one with less dates looks bigger, and the one with more dates looks lesser. Then the Muhajirin would come back, and they would say to the Muhajirin, pick whichever one you want, hoping that the Muhajirin would pick the lesser one where actually there is more dates in there. Because the Muhajirin would not want to think that they're taking the bigger pile, but there were sticks and stones making out it was bigger. What would happen? The Muhajirin would take the pile that actually had the lesser amount of dates in them, leaving the Ansar with the other side of dates. Sorry, they would pick up the one with the more dates, leaving the Ansar with lesser amount of dates. They would play these games and trick each other in order to try to make the other one benefit more. You take the greater amount of dates. I know you won't take it, so I have to trick you into taking these more amount of dates. This was the love between the Ansar and the Muhajirin. Another example of how much they loved each other, this is baffling if you think about this at the real human level. In Islam, there are set inheritance laws. The tabaqat are set, aren't they? And therefore, when someone passes away, depending on who is alive in the family, the parents or the spouse or the children, the tabaqat are set and the amount of inheritance is already set. Before these laws came in to Islam, before these ayat were revealed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Ansar, wishing to help the Muhajirin settle into Medina, do you know what they used to do? They used to include them in their inheritance before their own family members. When someone passed away, instead of first giving from their own inheritance to their family members, the Ansar would call the Muhajirin and say, we want you to take the first share of our wealth from inheritance. This practice continued to the extent that Rasulullah would have to tell the Ansar, stop doing this. The Ansar would not stop doing this. Do you know what happened? Eventually Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed 3 ayats of Quran organizing the inheritance laws in order to make it wajib that the generosity of the Ansar would stop. Think about this for a minute. At a real human level. Yesterday, the Medinan community would war with each other for 200 years, these same tribes. A few weeks with Rasulullah and they are giving away their inheritance before they give it to their own family members. Rasulullah in the Medinan community broke the shackles that were upon them, which was the way in which they thought about the other human being, the way in which they initially perceived each other as enemies and made them see each other as brothers in humanity. This is why Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib salawatullah wa salamuhu alayhi says, either he is your brother in faith or he is your equal in humanity. Where did these notions come from? Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam is a reflection of what Rasulullah instituted. This is how Rasulullah broke the shackles upon a society that hated each other and to the extent made them so much partisan of one another. Now, to conclude this, what are we saying here? What's being said for you and I to take away from these lessons? Society had different types of challenges. Society is not of one term, one nature. In Mecca, there was a society that had an overriding culture. In Medina, society had an overriding culture. Similarly, today, the world has many cultures, but it also has one global dominant culture. Rasulullah understood the way in which culture was, how the underlying assumptions and practices had breeded the way in which people practiced. Having understood it, he went about a mission of breaking those underlying causes, and as a result, humanity could burst forth. At 1 minute, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lambasts these people. Once Rasulullah breaks the shackles of their idol worship, the constriction of their thought, the hatred between people that governed the way in which they lived, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could then reveal the verse, Kuntum khayra ummatin ukhrijat linnas. You are the best of people that have been heralded for mankind. He took them from down here to up here within the space of a few years. Now this shows us what Islam actually is. Islam has something known as form, and Islam has something known as essence. Form is the outward appearance of Islam. What we wear, how we pray our salah, how we go on hajj. These are the outward distinguishing features of Islam. The internal feature of Islam is exactly what Rasulullah did, and it is surmised within one word, and that is liberation. Liberation from the self, liberation from the bad practices of society, liberation from the evils that man has written into people's practices. This is what Islam is. It is supposed to liberate you and I at the individual level and at the societal level. Now what this means is, and this is the conclusion to the 4 discussions as we go into today's challenges, this: if you and I are practicing a version of Islam that is not liberating the individual or the society, it it can be Islam by name and by outward form, but it is not practicing Islam in the essence of Islam. Does that make sense? If you are practicing Islam here in the Husayniyah, in your home, in society, and it is not liberating you and I from the ills of our features, our characters, or the ills of society, it is Islam, but it is an apparent version of Islam. It is not implementing the essence of Islam. You can recite Du'a Kumail for 50 years. If you don't change through it, you have practiced it. You have the outward form of Islam, but it's not liberated you in one way at all. You can say, Ya Rabbi, Ya Rabbi, Ya Rabb, qawwi ala khidmatika jawarihi, washdud ala al-azimati jaw. You can cry over Hussein ibn Ali, weep all you want. These are the outward forms of the religion. If it's not changing you, it is not liberating you, it is not really Islam. If you are practicing an Islam in this society, or Islam today is being practiced in a way that shackles the intellect, that causes us to become more and more like society, it is not really Islam. It is just Islam on the name. And this is the question I pose. Is Islam today a liberating force or not? Is Shiism a liberating force or not? Does Shiism change the world in any way, shape or form? Is it freeing slaves? Is it getting rid of pornography? Is it destroying nationalism? Is it changing poverty? If it's liberating society from its ills, then Islam haqiqi is being practiced. If it's just part and parcel of society, it is nothing more than Islam and Shiism by name. And this is what we mean, that Islam has become colonized. The practices are subsumed into the rest of the world, and religion has no practical impact on the rest of the world. Islam is a liberation theory, and it should be changing us internally and as society. And the only way to know if you and I are practicing Islam true is to know whether it's liberating us the same way in which Rasulullah liberated the people of Mecca and Medina. Inshallah, tomorrow night we will take a break from our series and we will commemorate the wafat of Lady Khadija alayhi salam. But thereafter, the following day, Friday, we will recommence and we will start talking about how the world is the way it is today, and we will go back into the 17th and 18th century Enlightenment era and understand how the Enlightenment has molded the world to be the way it is today. Inshallah, we can try to think about these things and really ask, to what extent is the Islam I am practicing liberating me, and liberating my family, liberating my Husayniyah, liberating society at large? If we ask that question, we would be a step closer to understanding the reality of what Islam is, inshallah. Walhamdulillah, Rabbil Alameen, wa salli ya Rabbi ala Muhammad wa alihi at-tahirin.